Sup guys, and welcome back. In this video we're going to go over the second basic movement pattern, which is the squat. Last video we went over the hip hinge. As exercise science students and also as practicum students, I expect you to have a pretty decent understanding of what a squat is. Now, in case you don't, the squat is pretty self-explanatory. It's simply moving from this standing position down into the squatting position and then back up. Right, so if I were to attempt to explain the squat using anatomical terms, what a squat is, it'll involve that eccentric triple flexion. It'll involve eccentric triple flexion of the lower limbs, so hip, knee, ankle, and then it'll be followed by concentric triple extension of the lower limbs. Again, hip, knee, ankle, from 1 to 2, maintaining that neutral spine. Now, last video we went over the hip hinge, and you've seen that in the hip hinge, the idea was that the hip would act as an axis of rotation between upper and lower body. In position 2 of the hip hinge, you had maximal flexion of the hip and minimal flexion of the knee. Well, the only difference between a squat and a hip hinge is that now not only do you have that maximal flexion in the hip, now you also have maximal flexion in the knee in position 2. Right, so now not only does the hip act as an axis of rotation between upper and lower body, now we have the knee acting as an axis of rotation between femur and shank. Right, now just that alone, it might overcomplicate what a squat is. You probably do have a decent understanding. So more importantly, what I really want to get into is the purpose of why we squat our athletes. Alright, so if you take anything away from the description of what a squat is, I really want you to understand that what we're trying to coach our athletes is how to use these movement patterns. The squat is a very functional movement pattern, whether you're looking at it from activities of daily living or you're looking at sports performance. That eccentric triple flexion followed by that concentric triple extension can be seen throughout daily living and also in any kind of sporting activities. For example, anytime you go to sit down or anytime you go to stand up, you're performing that squat movement pattern. Anytime you go to lift a heavy object off the floor, assuming that you're lifting it correctly, you are again performing that squat pattern. If you look at sporting activities, if you look at an offensive lineman in a three-point stance, he's in the squat. When he gets out of that squat, that mimics the concentric portion of the squat, the concentric triple extension of the lower limbs. If you look at a basketball player who's playing defense, they're typically in that squat position, right? Again, that flexion, the triple flexion of the lower limbs. And then when they get ready to jump, that'll be the concentric portion, the concentric triple extension, right? If you look at a tennis player, same thing. They're down low in that squat position, ready to move in whatever direction they need to move. If you look at a swimmer, in swimming, the transition when they push off the wall, that's a squat, right? So just take away that a squat is a very functional movement pattern, and what we're trying to do is really ingrain this movement pattern in our athletes' brains and in their bodies so that when they need to perform this movement pattern in their sporting activities, which they will, then they'd be able to properly call on this movement pattern. They'd be able to properly recruit whatever motor units it is they need to recruit in order to activate whatever muscles it is that they need to use to perform that activity, whether it be jumping or sprinting or things of that nature, right? Next, squat is great for lower body strength development, and that really ties into the injury risk management. So what we're trying to do with our athletes is adequately prepare the connective tissue that's surrounding the joints so that they can perform their sporting activities without getting hurt. For example, as athletes, in a lot of sports, it involves things like jumping, right? Well, the jumping is fine, but if you don't have the adequate strength to come down and land, right? Anytime you land or anytime you have those eccentric braking forces on the knee or the hip, that exudes a lot of force on the joints of the lower body, right? So what we're trying to do by getting them stronger is really trying to mitigate injury. For example, if you're sprinting and you're trying to rapidly decelerate in order to change direction, what we use things like the squat for is to make sure that we improve the joint integrity of the knee and the hip via eccentric training. so that when they are going to decelerate, we are able to properly absorb the forces being enacted upon us, and instead of just absorbing it, we're able to use it to transfer it into positive action to move in the other direction. So that's how it relates into sporting activities. And then again, we agreed that the squat is a great lower body strength development exercise. And then if we look at sport performance, if we look at any kind of power athletes, football, if we look at anything that involves power like sprinting or, basketball when they jump, the equation for power, if we want to develop a powerful athlete, is force times velocity. So now force is pretty self-explanatory. How much force can you generate? That can be expressed through load. How much weight can you lift? And now velocity would just be the speed of the movement. How fast can you perform it? So let's look at velocity as force, rate of force development, right? You can't really focus on rate of force development if you're not producing any force to begin with, because now you're producing force fast, but you're not really producing much force. So really, you're doing nothing fast, is the way I put it. And then on the other side of the spectrum, if you're only working on force, if you're developing force, you're getting the athlete stronger. If they can't express that strength fast, then you're not going to have a powerful athlete. So you can't really leave out either force or rate of force development from the equation. But what I want you to take away from this is that in order to have a powerful athlete, you have to get them stronger, right? It's my opinion that really in dealing with novice athletes, if we can get them stronger, we can get them better. If we can get them moving better, we can get them to play their sport better as well. So that's really the reason why we squat. And then going back to the main point, being that squat is a very functional movement pattern, pretty typically you hear those arguments, from sporting coaches that, squatting isn't sport specific, or it's not functional because when are we ever going to be on a court or on the field with 400 plus pounds on our back going down and up? Well, if you're not a powerlifter or you're not an Olympic weightlifter, then squatting isn't going to be sport specific. We use it more so as GPP. We use it as a tool to develop the strength, like we talked about, in a more general sense, so that we could send them back to the sports coaches, and then they can teach them how to express that in their sport. So again, main takeaways is that the squat is a movement pattern. The movement pattern of the squat is something that we want to ingrain in our athletes so that they can call upon it when they need to use it in their sport. Injury risk management, make them stronger. If we get the connective tissue surrounding the joint stronger, then they can perform better without getting hurt. If they're landing, they can absorb the forces. If they're rapidly decelerating to change direction, they can absorb those forces. And then not only can they absorb those forces, they can transfer it into positive action, because now we've worked on force, and we can also work on rate of force development by differing the loads. So that's why we squat. Progressions for a squat. Typically, we go from a goblet squat to a front squat to a back squat. So few key points we'll talk about in this goblet squat. As you can see in the picture, she's just holding the kettlebell out in front of her chest. What I want you to focus on, the feet should be about shoulder width apart. When you come down into the goblet squat, the elbows should be inside the knees, right? You're going to go ahead and initiate movement from the hips in order to lower it. The depth is pretty subjective, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I just really want you to understand feet positioning, about shoulder width apart, coming down, neutral spine, and then the knee should be out. So feet, shoulder width, knees, pushing out. That's your takeaways. Because you see the same thing in this front squat, right? Feet, shoulder width, knees, out, neutral spine. Now for the front squat, really what you're looking for is the grip outside the shoulders, so you definitely don't want them too narrow here, and then you don't want them out too wide. Typically the way that we get their grip is we put the hands down in anatomical position. Whatever the Q angle is, the distance between the hip and the wrist, we're just going to go ahead and flex at the elbow, turn the hand, that's where we get our grip. So it's always going to be outside of the shoulder. Then the elbows, we always want it to be parallel with the floor. So if you see this picture here, the triceps. The triceps should be parallel with the floor, and then you're driving the elbows up the entire time. His chin is nice and neutral. His eye gaze is slightly up. The eye gaze is pretty much negligible, and we'll go over that for the back squat. Take away this, feet shoulder width, knees out, neutral spine, triceps parallel with the pretty good front squat. Back squat, right? So you can't really see, the width of the feet. Let's just say that the width of the feet is shoulder width apart. Back squat, where the barbell will be, is typically somewhere in between the traps and the top of the rear delts. You're going to go ahead and create that shelf. Doesn't show the elbow in this picture, but really what I want you to get is that eye gaze again. So notice the chin. The chin will always be pretty neutral, right? So what we don't want, if we don't want the chin to come up and we don't want the chin to come down, that creates a cervical spine fault, energy leakage throughout the movement. The next one is a little bit better in explaining it. So we want the distance between the chin and the chest to be the same throughout the whole movement, whether you're standing or you're at the bottom position of the squat. Again, neutral spine. The elbow should be in the same line with the body. So you don't want them to be hiked all the way back to where the bar is going to be in their trap and pushing them forward. You have that anterior glide in the shoulder. That's something that you don't want. So let's go ahead and keep the elbow down in the same line with the body. Depth. Pretty typically you'll see that strength coaches will say they want the thigh to be parallel with the floor, or they want the hip to be lower than the knee or equal to the knee. Depth is pretty much subjective, 1 to the athlete and then 2 to the sport that they play. For example, on average, most people would be able to get down to, or get their hip to be at the same level of their knee. But if you have a taller athlete, say a basketball player or a volleyball player, they might have longer femur segments. It's going to be a lot more difficult for them to get their hip to the same level of their knee. So we might count it as a win to have their hip slightly higher than the knee. 1, because their segment length is a lot longer, their femur is a lot longer, and then 2, if they're playing basketball or they're playing volleyball, then really when are they going to be in that deep squat position, right? So as we develop athletes, understand that athletes will get, their muscles will get stronger based on the range of motion that you load, right? So if you want them to get stronger in a certain range of motion, go ahead and load that range of motion, but ask yourself, are they going to be performing this movement pattern at any time during their sport? If you look at, let's say, if we look at an offensive lineman, he's going to be in a deeper squat than a wide receiver. So we might load that a little bit different. That's just my perspective on that. Just understand that we're training athletes for their sport, and again, take into consideration their segment lengths when it comes to depth. So I'm going to say that depth is pretty subjective. So just to recap, we went over the squat. Again, the movement pattern is simply eccentric triple extension of the lower limbs followed by concentric the lowering is eccentric triple flexion of the lower limbs. The concentric would be a concentric triple extension of the lower limbs, neutral spine, knees out, feet shoulder width apart. Why we squat? We want to be able to ingrain those motor patterns within our athletes so that they can call upon it in their sporting activity whenever they need it, which they will. Injury risk management, we have to develop the musculature surrounding the joints, the connective tissue surrounding the joints, so that basically they don't get hurt performing the skills necessary for them to succeed at their sport, whether they're jumping and landing or they're rapidly decelerating in order to change direction. We want to make sure that we develop their joint integrity so that nothing is going wrong, or their ACLs aren't just flying everywhere when they get ready to change direction or when they land from a counter movement jump, or things of that nature, basically. And then strength development, we want to be able to get them stronger so that we can get them more powerful, so that we can send them to their sports coaches and they can express that power in their sporting activities. And then we talked a little bit about the goblet squat, the front squat, And the back squat, as far as feet, again, feet hip width apart. With the feet, you're going to have active feet. Something I didn't mention, you want active feet, you're going to go ahead and screw those feet into the ground. The way I put it, you want the toes straight forward, and you want to try to externally rotate at the hip without rotating the foot. Right, so typically I'll give them about 10 degrees external rotation. I give some people coach 10 and 2, 12 o'clock, things like that. So somewhere in between, ideally 12 o'clock, but somewhere in between 12 o'clock and 10 and 2. Knees are always out, neutral spine. In this front squat, you want the elbows up, triceps parallel with the neutral. Eye gaze is pretty negligible as long as they have that neutral cervical spine. And then the back squat, again, eye gaze. The weight distribution should be midfoot, right? So we won't want them on their heels, and then we definitely don't want them on their toes. Depth is pretty subjective to 1, the athlete, and then 2, their sporting activity. Again, neutral spine should be in line with the body. So you don't want it hiked back. You definitely don't want it in front of the body. Make sure that it's pointed down in line with the body. And then you can use that trick with, the spacing between the chin and the chest should always be the same, whether you're standing or you're down in that bottom position of a squat. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and link up a few videos that show you, what a squat is, what are some common errors in performing the squat, and then some tricks or some, I should say, strategies to help fix those faults in the squat. So what I want you to do is, 1, go ahead and watch those videos. Go ahead and try to squat. If you feel like you're adequate in the squat, maybe have somebody watch you. Make sure that you're not, you don't have any of these faults that we just talked about. And then once you feel like you have adequate knowledge on how to adequately perform a squat, then go ahead and take somebody else through the progressions, the goblet, the front, and then the back squat, and then really try to coach them up, try to eliminate any faults. Alright, so that's it for the squat. I'll go ahead and load up another video just like we did the hip hinge, how we broke it up into two separate series, and then I'll also talk about the common errors, progressions, regressions, and things like that. Alright, so I'll see you guys in the next video.